We are pleased to be hosting today's events at the NSCC Acreley campus as part of this broader national gathering, which is being streamed across the country. We welcome the rest of Canada into our conversations today for this session through the Together Ensemble online broadcast. A full online conference program and broadcast schedule is available at togetherensemble.ca. In today's session, we are going to be addressing how communities in Atlantic Canada can prepare for the impacts of climate change. Atlantic Canadians are adaptable people, but the pace and scale of climate change brings unique challenges. We need solid plans and teamwork to help us respond and proactively adapt. Nova Scotia has been given a very extreme example of the importance of community support during the recent climate emergencies, the wildfires in Shelburne and Barrington and in the Halifax Regional Municipality. Today, we're going to be hearing from three speakers who each offer a different perspective on community climate resilience. First, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Kirk Herman. I'm going to be your moderator today for the panel. I'm an environmental engineer with NSCC Facilities and Engineering. We work on climate change related projects across the province. Sustainability is part of everything we do at NSCC. It's a key organizational value and it's embedded into our strategic priorities. It encompasses how we design, construct, and operate our buildings, how we manage resources, how we provide a safe, healthy, equitable environment in which to work and learn. In support of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we're dedicated to advancing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which aim to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all global citizens. At NSCC, with 14 campuses across the province, teaching a variety of programs from agriculture to information technology, NSCC covers a much broader geographic region than some other educational institutions. This coverage presents us with the opportunity to communicate the message of sustainability and climate action to a wide and diverse audience. We have embraced this opportunity and are committed to being leaders in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change in our communities. The NSCC Climate Change Action Plan outlines a pathway for our institution to make a sustainable and significant impact on sustainable development in our province as we work with communities to address climate change. The content of our action plan focuses on three key themes: mitigation, adaptation, and education. Each theme contains several goals tailored to our unique nature of our institution. Together, our goals and supporting actions have the potential to build upon an existing NSCC capacity to create a culture of innovation and continuous improvement that will inspire the workforce of tomorrow. So please allow me to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Carla Arsenault. Carla Arsenault is the principal of the Nova Scotia Community College Marconi campus. A proud Cape Bretoner, she is passionate about building stronger communities. Prior to NSCC, Carla served as president and chief executive officer of the Cape Breton Partnership. Carla earned a Bachelor of Public Relations with a certificate in marketing, as well as a master's in business administration, specializing in management consulting, and has worked in the areas of management consulting, business strategy, research, marketing, communications, and operations management. She spent 15 years in the global corporate sector with Hewlett-Packard and Electronic Data Systems, designing solutions to operational barriers and challenges, and operated her own management consulting company from 2009 until 2017. Carla serves on the board of directors of Marine Atlantic Incorporated and Engage Nova Scotia. She lives in Sydney River with her husband and 3 children. Alex Cadell is the climate services specialist for Nova Scotia, working in a shared role between the Provincial Department of Environment and the Provincial Department of Environment and Climate Change and Climate Atlantic, the climate services hub for Atlantic Canada. Alex's work involves supporting Nova Scotians in assessing, understanding, and applying information about climate change. Alex holds a Bachelor in Science in Environmental Science from the University of Guelph and a Master of Climate Change from the University of Waterloo, along with experience that includes downscaling climate projections for municipalities, climate adaptation planning in the forestry sector, and managing climate change impacts along with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. Finally, we have Choice Chappell. Choice Chappell graduated with both her Bachelor's of Environmental Studies and Master's of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Prince Edward Island. In both degrees, she looked at the complexity of social systems and needs in relation to the natural environment. She currently works for the Voluntary Resource Center in Charlottetown, PEI, and for the Regional Atlantic Council for International Cooperation in Halifax with the Nova Scotia-based headquarters. Academically and occupationally, her biggest interests and goals are climate change mitigation and adaptation, and the social work and understanding around them, with a great appreciation for the storytelling and artwork mediums that connect people with people on an emotional level. Born in the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia, Choice has now spent a total of 20 years on PEI, but considers the entirety of Atlantic Canada to be her home. So to kick us off, Alex is going to come up and give us a presentation. So I invite Alex to come up and speak to that now. Thank you.
Wonderful. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction and, of course, the invitation to be here as part of the conference here today. I'll just be talking for 15 minutes or so to set some context for the panel discussion we're about to have on how Atlantic Canada's climate is changing. So if we're talking about our changing climate, first, let's make sure that we're all on the same page about what exactly our climate is. We're all very familiar with the idea of weather. Sometimes it's hot or cold outside, wet or dry, cloudy or windy, but these are terms that reflect the day-to-day changes in our atmosphere. When I'm talking about climate, I'm really talking about the long-term patterns and averages of those weather systems over periods of at least 30 years is what's considered standard there. And that's because we need to look at enough information to understand what is normal statistically for a certain region over that period of time for the type of weather that we used to get. So if we understand what is normal for our region over time, we can start to look at why that's changing, which leads us to greenhouse gases. As you may be familiar, these are compounds that just due to their molecular structure are very effective at trapping heat within our atmosphere. This includes gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Things good there? Okay. And of course, the concentrations of all of these gases have been increasing in our atmosphere due to human activities. So I always like this chart. This is showing CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere over the last 10,000 years, which I always think is at least the period of time most relevant to modern human civilization at the very least. We can see that over, again, scale might be small here, but over a lot of that time, CO2 concentrations were very stable, somewhere around 270 parts per million or so, until this very dramatic spike that started a few hundred years ago, which coincides with our widespread, exponentially increasing human use of fossil fuels. And of course, actually, just to say, as of last week, when I put this together, latest CO2 reading in the atmosphere was around 424 parts per million. And of course, useful to recognize that as of yet, we haven't really seen any really strong indication that that year-over-year increase in emissions is slowing down, let alone leveling off or decreasing, which is really what we need, because our climate won't stop changing until greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere stop increasing. And of course, even then, we'll be dealing with an altered climate for quite some time. And that's due to the long residence time of these gases in the atmosphere. So what I mean by that is carbon dioxide and gases like that often take decades, sometimes even centuries, to naturally be withdrawn from the atmosphere. So that when we do make the choice to emit greenhouse gases, we should also recognize that we have signed ourselves up to deal with the consequences of that for generations to come. But if we take information like that and turn an eye towards the future, we can start to understand what our future climate might look like in more specific regions. So we typically do that by using complex climate models that simulate all of the different characteristics of our climate system, our atmosphere, our land, our oceans, all the interactions between them, to help us understand how that system operates and how it responds to certain stressors like increasing greenhouse gases and understanding some of the long-term patterns there. Now, of course, when we're talking about understanding what the future might look like, it's really important to acknowledge that there's uncertainty associated with that. And a lot of that is due to uncertainty about what we will do as human society. What types of choices will we make and how will that impact our future? So just within the climate science space, one thing that we use to explore that a little bit more is climate change scenarios that kind of represent different plausible futures, different choices that we may be able to make. So just to briefly describe what's being shown on the chart here, this is temperature projections for Halifax from 1950 through to 2100. I'm not going to get into all of the details here, just wanted to sort of use this as a tool to help describe scenarios. We can see that there's a few different options that we're typically using at the moment within climate science. Something like that high emission scenario shown in red there is kind of more reflective of the emissions trajectory that we have been on to date. It is useful for planning around for that reason. And even really optimistic low emission scenarios like what's shown in blue on the bottom there. Note that even our future climate under incredibly optimistic conditions is still quite a bit different from what our future climate used to be, which is denoted in the gray there. So certainly while our decisions today have a very significant impact on what our future might look like. But one thing I do always like to point out is that for the next several decades, we can see that projections are actually quite consistent across scenarios. And that's a reflection of our climate system adjusting to the greenhouse gases we have already emitted. So useful to understand that our decisions today absolutely matter further into the future, but for the near term, we have a good understanding of the path that we're heading down. And of course, that rate of warming that we are already currently experiencing will result in some quite different climate conditions. And that warming is a concern for many of our built and natural systems that are designed for or adapted to that range of historical climatic conditions that we are departing from. So hopefully that was some useful, just foundational concepts for the actual information I'm going to be talking about how Atlantic Canada's climate is changing. So trying to make this as broadly applicable as possible to all 4 provinces. And there's usually 5 key trends that I talk about that I think are useful for the average person to know about how Atlantic Canada's climate is changing. We'll talk through each of these in turn with a little bit of information on some data and hazards. But just to start here, so those 5 trends are: it's getting warmer in Atlantic Canada, our precipitation patterns are changing, we're anticipating more frequent and more intense storms, sea levels are rising, and our oceans are changing. So to start with, it's getting warmer. Just to briefly describe the chart here, I'm showing data for all 4 Atlantic provinces: New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and Labrador, across 3 different time periods. So first there, showing an average year in a historical period, 1976 through 2005, shows kind of what our climate used to be like on average in those provinces during that period of time. Next to that, we have data that's sort of for the near future up to mid-century, representing an average year in 2021 through 2050. So again, pretty much regardless of our choices today, these are the types of changes we really need to be preparing for in the decades to come. And then on the right, showing a typical year under a high emission scenario in the period 2051 through 2080. So this is what we could be on track for if we don't see some relatively immediate and relatively drastic reductions in global emissions. So still a small window here to avoid this part of our future, but potentially for some of our longer term planning, it's something useful to plan around. So that being said, let's talk about what this means for something like mean annual temperature, which is if we just take the average temperature from every day over full calendar year, this is a number that we get. So looking at historically compared to where we'll be sort of by mid-century or so, across all 4 provinces, we can see an increase of about 2 degrees Celsius or so in our mean annual temperature. And by the end of the century, again, under that high emission scenario, an increase of around 4 degrees Celsius or so. So obviously that's quite substantial, though I know mean annual temperature doesn't necessarily mean a lot to our day-to-day lives, but if we take that information and apply it to other types of variables, we can anticipate that our hottest days will be much hotter. We can anticipate that we'll have more days that will be under extreme heat warning thresholds, for example. So particularly in summer, some of our days and nights will be a lot more uncomfortable for those of us that are used to this climate than they were historically. Winters are warming most rapidly out of all of our seasons, meaning that we'll see less extreme cold temperatures and we'll see more temperatures above freezing. I know we experienced that in the region that I live, at least this winter. It was quite brown, not a whole lot of snow, and that's the type of conditions we can anticipate more of in the future. And of course, that's increased risk of longer, more extreme, more intense extreme heat events drives up our risks of things like heat waves. That has implications for public health, for outdoor work and recreation, species and ecosystems that aren't adapted to those conditions, and even some of our infrastructure, particularly things like transportation, electricity infrastructure, aren't really well designed to deal with those high heat conditions. Wildfires and droughts are another one that's useful to mention here. Even if precipitation stays the same and we get hotter temperatures, that sort of dries things out a little bit more. That's exactly the type of conditions we saw that led to the wildfires happening currently. And those types of warmer conditions can be anticipated to occur a little bit more frequently in the future. Well, the second key message here is around our changing precipitation patterns. Again, a similar chart just to highlight that across Atlantic Canada, anticipating increases in total annual precipitation of about 5 to 8% or so by mid-century, somewhere around 9 to 14%, depending where you are by the end of the century. However, one thing I always like to point out is that more precipitation falling doesn't necessarily result in wetter conditions on the ground. Again, thinking back to those warmer temperatures I just talked about, recognizing that drives up rates of evaporation and transpiration, and water could certainly run off in greater volumes and more intense downpours as well, which I'll touch on in just a moment. Another trend here is that as temperatures warm, we'll see more precipitation falling as rain instead of as snow. And as I just, I guess, alluded to, we're also seeing a trend towards more intense rainfall events. So larger volumes falling in shorter periods of time, which does drive up our risk of flooding. So that leads us nicely into the third key message I mentioned. We're anticipating more frequent and more intense storms. And here specifically referring to tropical storm, hurricane type events that form well to the south of us, make their way up the coast and occasionally impact Atlantic Canada. And that increase in frequency and intensity of these types of events is really driven by warming oceans that enable these storms and storm systems to travel much further north before weakening. Again, that's exactly the type of conditions we saw with Hurricane Fiona in the fall. Ocean temperatures, so sea surface temperatures, I should say, along its track north were several degrees higher than they would typically be at that time of year, which is why that storm was able to maintain so much strength and why it broke so many records in our region. Associated with these stronger storms, we can anticipate some slight increases in peak wind speeds associated with these storm events by the end of the century, and certainly expecting that more powerful, more intense, more destructive storm surges could be brought to our coasts. And of course, this brings hazards like coastal and inland flooding to our region, erosion along our coasts, and potentially things like high wind events and landslides in cases as well. Fourth, sea levels are rising. So more specifically, around Atlantic Canada, expecting sea level rise, median projections of up to 1 meter or so by 2100. Of course, that very much depends on exactly where you are. For example, Eastern Cape Breton Island is kind of at the higher end of that range, whereas some parts of Northern Labrador, it's much lower. But really, across a lot of Atlantic Canada, somewhere in that 60 centimeter to 100 centimeter range by 2100 is what we're anticipating at this point in time. It's quite substantial and something that we really need to be planning around. Now, as I mentioned, that's a median projection. So in some cases, it's really important to be more risk averse in some of our coastal developments, for example. So it's useful to point out that some of our higher impact scenarios that account for accelerated warming in the Antarctic ice sheet, for example, could add an additional 70 centimeters or so of sea level rise on top of that amount by 2100. And in some cases, that's useful to plan around. And of course, remembering that the actual water levels we experience will still be influenced by things like storm surge. We saw surges of well over 2 meters with Hurricane Fiona in the fall, as well as high tides and coastal geomorphology. So it's not just that up to 1 meter of sea level rise, but what happens if a storm hits at high tide with that sea level rise scenario? Where does that put our water levels, and how prepared are we for that? And of course, hazards associated with sea level rise include that coastal flooding, which I was just mentioning, but also saltwater intrusion, which could reduce the availability of fresh water in some of our coastal aquifers, and damage to coastal ecosystems as well. Particularly things like dunes and salt marshes that play a really important buffering role on our coasts may not be able to keep pace with this rate of sea level rise and continue providing that same level of protection in all places. And finally, our oceans are changing. So just to highlight a few trends here, we're seeing increased ocean temperatures, both at the surface and in deep water, which impacts ocean processes. And we're certainly seeing ocean heat waves becoming longer and more frequent. Our oceans are becoming more acidic, which can corrode organisms that form carbonate shells and also increases the likelihood of algal blooms forming in marine waters. And we're seeing a trend towards decreased marine oxygen levels as well, which has a whole variety of implications for the health and distribution of many of our aquatic species and habitats. So I know there's a very rapid primer on climate science and how Atlantic Canada's climate is changing. I hope that's some useful context for the discussion to come. One final slide before we get back to that. We'll be talking about some adaptation concepts. So thought it would be useful to just provide a little bit of a primer on some different elements of resilience and risk and vulnerability. So really everything I've just been talking about here is the hazard component of climate risk, which is just one aspect of this. So of course, we could have sea level rise in a location where no one is or nothing is there that's particularly vulnerable to it. And that really doesn't become a risk at that point. It's just something that's occurring. So hazards is one part of this. The other piece is exposure. So that is the presence of something that we care about, whether that's people, species, infrastructure, natural or cultural assets in a place that could be affected by a climate hazard. And then the other component of this is vulnerability, which is itself a function of sensitivity and capacity. So sensitivity is the degree to which something is affected by a climatic change. For example, we could have power lines in a location where a high wind event is occurring. If they're above ground, they're significantly more sensitive to that event than if they're below ground. And then finally, capacity, which is our ability as a society to manage those changing climate conditions. So that ability could take the form of anything from skills to information to money, whatever resources that we need to be able to take action there. And just because there are questions on this, differentiating between coping and adaptive capacity. So coping capacity is really the short term. How do we respond to this event using currently available resources? Whereas adaptive capacity, we have a bit more of a longer term view. What resources should we get in place to better prepare ourselves for this in the future? So hopefully that's some useful context for the questions we're about to get into, but that is all that I wanted to say before we get over to that. So turn things back over to Kirk here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. So now I'm going to invite Carla and Choice up to the chairs here along with Alex, and we're going to get into a bit of a panel discussion with some specific questions.
Hold these right up to your mouth. Okay, great.
So gonna hop right into it. I think the first question we're gonna ask, maybe we'll start with Choice, put you on the spot. And feel free to pass the mic around and answer as we see fit. But what do you see as the biggest challenge facing Atlantic Canadians when it comes to climate change resiliency?
So personally, can you hear me well? Yeah. Personally, I think it kind of comes down to two broad categories: resources, or in this case, lack thereof, and ruralness. So when we talk about resources, and I really hate, taking everything down to its minute, tiny thing, because everything is part of something greater, and taking everything and breaking it down is very almost economic in a way, and economics has not solved the climate change crisis, we know this, but for one, resource. So we have very few resources in Atlantic Canada compared to a large portion of the rest of Canada, territories notwithstanding, of course. We are very blessed to be living in what's considered to be a developed country. Therefore, we do have more resources than many in the world, but it has become evident through Hurricane Fiona, through the wildfires, through COVID-19, that we have very few resources. And I'm not just talking about the very specific resources to deal with the technical issues of climate change. I mean, in general, we have not a lot of skilled people in a wide variety of capacities. We don't have a lot of capacity for various social issues. As mentioned before, I'm from Prince Edward Island. I can name one women's shelter on Prince Edward Island, which is really important to climate change, because in extreme weather events, women are during and after more likely to be victims of violence, both from intimate partners and more broadly from strangers. And while there's not a lot of research on it, I'm sure this also affects other groups, our Indigenous peoples, our people of color, who are also quite often victims of violence. So broadly, these resources, they're unfortunately not there. And as we have more problems, these resources dwindle. So for example, if we wanted to take the tree as a unit of resource, whether we want to consider it to be future lumber, whether we want it to be aesthetic, whether we want it to be something that can sequester carbon, Hurricane Fiona and the wildfires took out a huge swath of those resources. We now have fewer to deal with. We have not a lot of money in the region or a lot of people with skills to replace those resources. As we know, people came from out of province to help with the wildfires and are currently working around the clock in many places. That's the type of thing we have for our capacity for resources. When Hurricane Fiona hit, Prince Edward Island, 90% of us lost power, some of us for 3 weeks. We had to have people not just from other places in Atlantic Canada, but from as far as Ontario to help restore our power, again, for over 3 weeks. That's a huge loss. And the problem is that we need a good baseline of resources in order to prepare our capacity for future change. Think about it in terms of, again, I already said I hate the economy, but when people are in terms of, I don't hate the economy, in terms of comparison, I hate using economist ways of comparing. However, when think about people that are in poverty, people that are in debt, when you remove that debt, their capacity to put money into their savings and prepare for future issues becomes so much greater. But when they are in debt, they just become more and more in debt. And this is on an individual level, communal level, a national and international level. But as we have our resources being removed, as those trees go away, as people with skills leave the area, as we have lowered capacity, we are at a higher disadvantage to prepare ourselves in a baseline where we can be resilient to come back. And unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that. It's a long-term, multifaceted issue. In terms of ruralness, we are rural and people are rural in a very different level of capacity in many ways. So in terms of Canada, again, territories notwithstanding, we're one of the more rural places, both in terms of population, where we're situated, and that also creates some misunderstanding on the national level. For example, if we wanted to look at forestry, because wildfires are very relevant, very important, most of Canada is in a boreal forest. We are not. We are in the Maliseet-Mi'kmaq forest, more officially known as the Acadian forest, which has its own ecosystem, its own needs, its own challenges, and its own way of needing to relate. But a lot of people outside of Atlantic Canada would not understand that. So we have the national ruralness. Of course, we then have more local ruralness. People are often in small communities. A lot of people don't know that in PEI, our capital city, the population is about 40,000 people. I myself, I live outside of a town of 3,000. I'm personally very rural, but you can take that further and further. You have different rural municipalities, different rural individuals. We have socially isolated people for a wide variety of reasons, newcomers who do not have networks. We have people with disabilities that might be to the point where they are unable to leave their house in any easy capacity. Ruralness is not just about that physical, geographical ruralness, but also social isolation. There's very big challenges there. And as we know, these two feed into each other. Because we are so rural, those resources, when we have them, it's so much harder to get them out there. If there was a wildfire in HRM versus elsewhere, as we know there has been, HRM has one of the largest populations in Nova Scotia. What's the priority? The largest number of people? Perhaps a larger wildfire? We don't necessarily always have plans for this. And even if people are given, different locations are given the same priority, they then have different needs, both the people living in a more urban environment and the people who are living in a more rural environment.
Thanks, Joyce. Great answer.
Thank
you. Very, very good. Carla, you want to chime in?
Sure. I think, I think one of the other pieces to this too is that until recently, it's always seemed like it was something that other people had to deal with, right? Fires and floods and natural disasters were things that happened in other countries and in other parts of this country, but not here until, really you think about it, in the last 10 months with Hurricane Fiona and the wildfires alone, it's almost like we are now faced with the reality that, oh, it can happen here too. And I think that's something that both at a material and a physical level, in terms of the things that Joyce mentioned, relative to the infrastructure and supports that we have, but also I think at an emotional level for Atlantic Canadians, it's always been somebody else's disaster, and now we have to recognize that as a community and as a region, it's now our problem too.
Yeah, Alex?
Sure. You've heard me talk at length about hazards, and I think you two have touched on some really key points there, so I'll just be very brief. I think one other interesting side of this when we're talking about vulnerability is just reimagining what the future looks like, and the fact that we're really not used to what that means. Often get that sort of technocratic idea in our head of the future is just an electrified version of today. And that's part of it, but it's certainly not all of it. So what other value systems do we need to be taking advantage of or learning from to reconsider what being in balance with our natural systems looks like? Like those are the types of challenges that, again, we're not really used to thinking about in Atlantic Canada, but are a really important part of this puzzle and trying to identify appropriate solutions going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, great responses. Joyce, your kind of commentary on like the economy of the whole economy nature of it really resonated with me. When you face these events, whether it's fire or it's a snowstorm or hurricane, if your power goes out, can you afford to have a generator, right? If you live in a rural area, can you afford to have a reliable vehicle that you can use every day?
Can you use the vehicle? Are you snowed in?
Right.
Are there power lines down?
Yeah. Are you physically able to shovel yourself out, right? Like it often becomes like a monetary solution to these problems, which leaves a lot of vulnerable communities behind. So yeah, that really resonates with me as well. Just moving on to the next part, just to kind of talk a little bit about how we can help communities adapt to climate change and be more resilient. I want to talk about that concept of coping capacity that Alex mentioned. So coping capacity is really that immediate response in a community when you're facing a crisis. It's obviously in everyone's minds right now in Nova Scotia, what's going on in Shelburne and Edmonton, and what happened in HRM and Tantallon last week. That's the kind of coping capacity. How quickly can you scale up the nature of the response within the community to provide those supports? So what do we see as some of the big challenges there, and what can we look to do to provide better coping capacity in our communities? And maybe we'll start with Carla, if that's all right. Yeah.
Sure. And as we just said, Nova Scotians have been through a lot. Atlantic Canadians have been through a lot in the last number of years. Nova Scotia Community College has 14 campuses, 13 physical campuses, and a number of other locations across the province, which provides us with a tremendous amount of capacity to be there for community in ways that probably we haven't been before. And I had some conversation earlier with others around how communities themselves are evolving in the nature of communities. And you think about the institutions 40 years ago that used to run the communities. It was, you know, the local service clubs, it was the legions, the churches, the community halls. With aging demographics and you know and decline of population in rural areas, our communities are looking very different. So there is a role for post-secondary institutions in particular, I think, to really step up and be part of that solution. For us, it's really, I think, about putting the community in community college and really sort of owning that space. You know, so I think colleges and universities, post-secondary in particular, can support in a number of ways. Obviously, education and training itself is a big one, whether it's programs we offer through core programs or continuing education thing, you know, research. But there's also other pieces too, and I think, you know, you think about our role as a community organizer, our role as emergency responders, for example. I can give a couple specific examples that have happened just in the last 10 months. Last week with the fires in Shelburne County, one of our campuses, the Shelburne campus was evacuated, but the Yarmouth campus was able to step up and become a temporary nursing home for that community. And you know, as we were able to take in, I think it was about 65 residents and provide some very urgent need for that community. Last fall, our campus in Sydney, our Marconi campus, provided thousands of meals for the power crews. While we ourselves had no power, running on generator with volunteers that were coming in and preparing thousands of meals at a time when we and ourselves were sitting in the dark and using flashlights. So you know, there's certainly, I think, a role there. The community organizer one is another one too, though. You know, not only do post-secondary institutions, as an example, have we have students, but we have a lot of staff, and those staff are networked in the community. They know people, they are part of organizations themselves. They are really ambassadors, I think, for the institutions to which they work. And with that, our ability to mobilize and bring people together at a very short notice is really strong, and we need to use that, I think, to our advantage. It's quite astounding how in times of crisis people do come together, and so building those relationships through other means. You know, I give one example in particular. Our campus is being relocated from its current campus on 1240 Grand Lake Road, in a little outside of town, into a downtown waterfront campus that we'll be moving into next year. And because of that, we're doing a lot of community engagement work. So this is, I think, a gift to us and to our college in having that, taking that opportunity to build those relationships in the community that we're in, and you know, so that when the next crisis hits, we've got those relationships formed. We know who to call. People know how to rely on us, and how we can support. How do we become comfort centers? How do we become, you know, and work with industry? How do we use our applied research capabilities through the Applied Research Center and so on? So there's so many ways, I think, that we can do that. And I think just again, that human capital piece of it, right? It's the resources and the people within the institution, even more so than the physical infrastructure itself.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's funny, you know, different perspectives, different roles, kind of how you see. Like when I think about adaptation and the coping capacity, I do, because I'm in the facilities world, that jump to that lens of, okay, how can we ensure that our facilities are resilient? So do we have backup power? Do we have heat pumps so that we can heat and cool in a cold snap or a heat wave? Do we have adequate ventilation? You know, some of our campuses in HRM, I think that's the email went out. We were able to shut off, ventilation system, bring in outdoor air, but keep our heat pumps on so that people could be comfortable, but didn't have to worry about breathing in any of the ash or dust that was coming from from the fires. So I think about, first of all, how can we make our buildings more resilient so that we can be that organization to call, to respond in that emergency, so that we're ready for that. And then it gets to that, what you're talking about, that broader community response. How do we help our communities organize that emergency response so that everybody knows their role? And yeah, the community college seems to be poised to kind of play that role, especially in our more rural communities. Just want to talk a little bit also about adaptive capacity. So coping capacity is how do we deal with that immediate threat. Adaptive capacity is really how do we see ourselves transition to face the threats that Alex kind of lined up in his presentation, those long-term threats that are going to get more severe and escalate heading into mid-century and late century. It's more of a long-term community planning thing. So just want to talk about that a little bit. Alex, where you kind of led us into that, maybe give you the first chance to talk about those issues.
Yeah, certainly. And maybe just as a lead into that, I'll just make a brief comment on the coping capacity piece as well.
Sure.
Just remembering that with the coping side of things, that's taking advantage of available skills, values, and resources to accommodate and overcome those adverse conditions. And while there is a ton of great examples across Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada of people coming together to deal with events when they occur, remembering that oftentimes those currently available resources are based on what was needed historically and don't really account for the evolving nature of hazards with climate change. So just as one example there, the latest provincial climate change risk assessment for Nova Scotia actually identified wildfire as the potentially most impactful risk for the province by mid-century. And part of that is a reflection of the changing climate conditions I was talking about, but a large part of that is also the reduced ability that our province has to cope with those types of events when they occur. And we've seen that very clearly in the last couple of weeks. You know, the province needing to make the very difficult decision to basically close the forests, which impacts livelihoods and recreation and well-being and all of those things in very different ways. But that's due to the fact that if another event were to have occurred, there was just no capacity to deal with it. So recognizing the limits of our ability to cope with our changing climate conditions is a really important part of that, and which is where adaptive capacity really comes in. What is needed to more proactively think about what resources are needed in place for the future, and kind of beyond the obvious, continuing to invest resources in building capacity and building skills in our population, which are all incredibly important. I just wanted to point out a couple of other things quickly. One is around the really important need to connect people, because there's a ton of fantastic work happening in different organizations by different people across Atlantic Canada. Just something that I've noticed in working with many of those people is they often feel like they're in it alone, at least as far as climate change is concerned. That it's up to them to figure out how climate change impacts them, what it means for the decisions they're trying to make and all of that. And that's really not the case. We're all dealing with very similar climatic trends, trying to tackle them in similar ways and try out pilot different solutions in our region and things like that. And the more we're able to break down those silos, connect different communities geographically, culturally, whatever that looks like, the better place we're going to be for that. So we really need to build networks that have the assets, the knowledge, the organization, and even the agency to be able to pursue those effective, just adaptation approaches. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that if there's any other comments on adaptive capacity.
Joyce, yeah, please.
So one thing that I believe that might be happening in our bureaucratic, more official systems, regarding adaptive capacity is a term called creeping normalcy. And creeping normalcy applies to everyone. So when we talk to some of our older adults, they will tell us how, you know, the winters, they used to have so much more snow and how they used to last longer. But now people are getting more used slowly to this changing climate. It's kind of like the frog boiling in the water, right? If everything suddenly changed in 1 year, we would all be up in arms and alarmed. But because things are changing slowly, it feels almost normal. It feels almost like it always was this way. It's almost kind of like we're being gaslit by the environment in a way, honestly. And I, as an optimist, I don't think that the fact that we are not working as quickly as we should to prepare our communities and prepare our provinces isn't just a lack of willingness, it's also that social creeping normalcy that lives in all of us socially and individually. Bureaucracy also moves very, very slow, as we know. So we have these very old policies, in many cases, not always, that are moving behind even what we understand now. For example, with Hurricane Fiona, as I mentioned, 90% of Prince Edward Island lost power. Large percentage of the people that didn't Well, they had the adaptive capacity because Summerside, the municipality of Summerside, a lot of it is solar powered, and they had taken up that initiative a long time ago. The rest of us powered by maritime electric. But after COVID-19, I felt fairly certain that if there was a big change coming, that the PEI government would be prepared to handle it. And when it came to Hurricane Fiona, I'm sorry to say it, but they weren't. And I think you've probably experienced this in HRM as well. I'm sure that other people all around Canada and even internationally have experienced this as well, where we are still continuously shocked as things get bad. But it also seems to be that we expect that the shock will allow us to prepare in the future, and it hasn't yet. And we need to address that creeping normalcy socially, individually, and in our government systems to kind of look at, okay, we have gotten too used to this. We have to remember that this is not the average, this is not normal, so that we can actually adequately plan for the future.
Thanks, Joyce. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Alex, go ahead.
So you reminded me one other thing that I wanted to say around adaptive capacity in terms of who needs it, which I think is one question we overlook sometimes, because it's certainly not just the people like myself that are working in climate change and adaptation on a daily basis. It's becoming abundantly clear that we need a lot more integrated understanding of climate change across a wide variety of different disciplines. That includes, lawyers, accountants, and health practitioners. Anyone that's trying to make decisions about how climate change is impacting our community services and infrastructure, our health, our ways of life really needs a good understanding of how climate change interacts with the decisions that they're trying to make. So keeping that in mind is really important for capacity as well.
I totally agree. When I talked about the themes of our climate plans, mitigation, adaptation, education, obviously there's a clear link to the skills and workforce development, but with the college and what we do. But I do think there's still a lot of education just on the core concepts of what climate change means. And this conversation today about adaptation, explaining coping capacity, explaining adaptive capacity, like these are the conversations that people in this room need to go out and take to their communities to make sure everybody's on the same page about what the issues are and how we can address them, because there's still a lot of that work to be done, for sure. Next kind of topic we wanted to touch on was that one of the key agenda items in the Sustainable Development Goals and the goals for 2030 is ensuring that no one gets left behind. However, we know that there are certain vulnerable groups that in particular are facing, they're going to be more adversely impacted by climate change. So I just want to talk a little bit about how can we ensure that we consider that when we're talking about climate resilience planning. And I'm going to go back to Joyce if we can, to kick us off.
So one thing that I think we all need to remember is that people are the experts of their own lives. If you want to know how to make sure no one is left behind, you go to the people. You can't just have standard surveys being sent out. You need to specifically look for the differences in all of us, the people that live rurally, the people that live with disabilities, people of different genders. All of it is extremely important. Again, people are the experts on their own lives. What we as researchers and planners need to do is to aggregate all that data, because even though people know themselves the best and know how they live their day-to-day lives the best, we then have to look at the bigger picture. It's not an individual person's responsibility to look at the bigger picture. But without going to them, without understanding a person's day-to-day life, which is extremely important when we're talking about resiliency, because the more we keep things normal for a person, the calmer they are, the more adaptive they are as an individual, the better it is for all of us, and we can make sure that we include them in our resilience planning. It does take a lot of effort, it takes a lot of time, but it's the only way that it works. However, bottom-up approach is not always the best approach either. I know that sounds contradictory. We know top-down approaches, they very much do not work, at least not without a large amount of pushback. For example, the carbon tax. Many people are still very, very mad about the federal carbon tax. And that's because, in my opinion, it was not introduced the best. Look at British Columbia. They had a carbon tax long before the federally mandated one. And while there were people that were unhappy, they made sure that there was some way that the communities felt valued. For example, in British Columbia, they get that money from the carbon tax back at the end of the year. Would people be happier if they knew in their province that the carbon tax was coming back to them, or if perhaps it was being invested in different services such as public transportation or other services that help offset climate? When we're just saying, okay, you have to pay more money, and we leave it at that, people are going to have pushback, and there will be a point at which things start boiling over. We have to understand the individual people's needs, and we have to make sure that we are giving back to their communities somehow. We have to make sure that they are heard and negatively affected as little as possible. The bottom-up approach, as I said, is not always the best, but neither is the top-down approach. Now, why is the bottom-up approach not always the best? Because it's still individualistic. What is best for me and my family may not be the best for my community. What's best for my community may not be the best for everyone in general. What we do and how we adapt to things the best can still have negative effects on the individuals, communities, the provinces around us. So you kind of need to work from both angles, where you have these community approaches, where you go to the individual people and the individual communities, you understand very intensely what their day-to-day life looks like and what their individual needs are and what their priorities are, while also making sure that there is people in place that are working together. So that way my household is not negatively affecting someone else's household, so that our community is not negatively affecting the other community down the road, so that our province is not negatively affecting another province, so that what Canada is doing is not negatively affecting what the United States is trying to do. It's all very, very important. The other thing is responsibility. We need to be perfectly clear on whose responsibility, what aspect of adaptation, mitigation, different parts of climate resiliency is whose. This is very important when it comes to the government, because when we're looking at Hurricane Fiona and wildfires and trying to get people situated after disasters, who is supposed to be doing what? The average person typically does not know. We need to be very clear on what the federal government's responsibility is, what the provincial government's responsibility is, municipal government, if applicable, because not everyone lives in a municipality. We have to be clear on what our responsibility is to ourselves, where we have to individually fill in the gaps because the government has not. So that way we perfectly understand how we can move through a situation and adapt and overcome these challenges. And then the other side of that is the community responsibility. But that's not the same as a legal responsibility or a formal responsibility that the government has to different levels of communities and people. That's more of a social contract. So what we need to do is, of course, first understand the government responsibilities, but we also need to talk to each other and come together and understand if another situation like this arises, or rather when another situation like this arises, who can do what, so that way we can move in the most efficient and helpful way possible to benefit the entire community, while also benefiting ourselves and benefiting others.
Thank you, Joyce. Yeah, Carla?
I think another piece to this too, in ensuring, I guess, that no one gets left behind is, and that's education, right? It starts at a very fundamental level with making education accessible to everyone, and ensuring that our vulnerable populations and our underrepresented groups, that everyone has the ability to receive an education, to have access to that education. And looking, so for NSDC as an example, right? What are those barriers that are preventing people from accessing that education, and what can we do more as an institution to ensure that it is accessible to everyone, and that could be everything from your diplomas and your degrees to your little workshops that are in the community that may be specifically about climate change, but making everything accessible to everyone is I think really about it's trying to level the playing field a bit.
Great.
Yeah, I guess just a quick comment on this angle as well, because I guess just a recognition that a lot of the groups that are most vulnerable to climate change often don't always even feel that it's relevant to them, because they're facing daily pressures that are rooted in a lot of systemic inequities that often feel a lot more pressing, a lot more urgent. And it's really on us who are trying to do this work to try and connect climate change to those daily pressures and to the equity and social issues that are really more top of mind for a lot of these people. And it's also just recognizing the breadth of what climate resilience is. It's not just keeping the lights on and trying to mitigate flooding. That's certainly part of it, but it's also providing diversified employment opportunities, making sure that people have access to health and education outcomes, providing improved quality housing, connections with the land, and ultimately just providing that opportunity for people to have a voice in the decisions that aren't impacting them. Like that's really what climate resilience looks like, and that's not just that involves a whole lot of people coming together to actually have those deeper discussions and make a difference there.
Thank you. Thank you all for your great responses today to all these questions. I think it was a very interesting discussion. We're just about out of time. So I do want to thank you all for your time today. Really great, diverse group of perspectives here. And then, yeah, just want to say thanks for sharing your perspectives with the audience.